So I actually changed the title of this paper, and this is because I just spent a week in Manchester with my parents, and I was reading all about AE, had the books strewn all over my mother's kitchen table. And she said, is this AE or AI you're talking about? So I said, that's actually much better than the prosaic title that I had that's featured in the guide. So I thought I'd go to it. And I think there is a connection. I'd like to kind of maybe, these are ideas that are still somewhat in flux, but I think there is, I'm going to make the case that the economic thought of AE is an incredible part of his legacy. I'm still trying to understand how the economics and the spiritual side work together, but I think they do, and I just need to kind of think a bit more about that. So some of these ideas are kind of playing out in this paper. But I also think they're incredibly relevant to today in this present moment as well. So hopefully that will come through. I should also say I'm a member of the Society of Co-op Studies Ireland and Dublin Food Co-operative over in Kilmainham, if they buy some very nutritious organic food cooperatively. We organised a huge conference in Belfast this February about cooperation on this island and across the UK. And I was happy to see many members of the George Russell AE Society in attendance at that. So I'm very grateful and very thankful for you doing that. So I'm delighted I can at least somehow repay that. If you're interested in the Society of Co-op Studies Ireland, please ask me for more details about how to join. We actually promote cooperative ideas in education, the propagandist element, I suppose, that was part of AE's work with the Irish homestead. We're trying to do it, although in a kind of less exciting way maybe, or certainly a less eloquent way, but we're trying. And it's also the International Year of Cooperative. So it's nice that these things have aligned. I've just come back from Manchester where there's so many kind of events around international cooperation. The International Cooperative Congress is happening today. So there's lots of things to be dispirited about, I think, when we think about geopolitics, but the thing about cooperation is that it's always being counter-cyclical and it always pushes back against maybe the worst aspects of our human nature. I also just want to make a shout out to Susan Mitchell, because she's not on these walls and she's an incredibly important person here as well in terms of being the sub-editor at the Irish Homestead and someone actually who worked very, very closely with AE. And in reading AE's letters, it's very clear that when Susan Mitchell passes, this is something that very, very deeply affects him. She's also an incredible writer, a very funny, witty poet, and I would urge everyone to go and look at the work of Susan Langstaff Mitchell. And there's a statue of her now in Carrick-on-Shannon, which is encouraging to see. So I also want to start with this picture because first of all, it's incredible and it's also very local to the area. So just in between 84, where we are, and 82, which is where W.B. Yeats lived. This is a caricature by Isabel Mary Macnee, which apparently records a real moment where these two gentlemen, good friends, were on their way to meet one another, and they walked past each other without realizing, even though they were kind of just a short minute away. So you have, and the caricaturist was also a poet, and she kind of captures, I think, something about their different personalities in the way Yeats is looking up towards the heavens. As she says in her poem, The Camel, as you survey this camel with surprise, you'll recognize it as a Nobel Prize. When it walks calmly with uplifted nose, I'm sure it's nearer heaven than to its toes. AE is actually portrayed much more affectionately, which I think is quite revealing in terms of the way these two characters would have been viewed within Dublin society at the time. She writes about AE, though you might think this beast with mostly hair, a poet lies concealed behind its fur. If like most others you revere this bear, at calling it a beast you will demur. More, for it is fur, in manner cabalistic, contains in one a poet, seer, and mystic. And I would argue as well, very, very importantly, an economist, because I think his economics really tie into his spiritualism in very profound ways. As I say, I'm still trying to join all these pieces together. And I actually think the fact that he's looking at the ground reflects the fact that he's a man of the world as well as a man of the fairies and the spirit, and that he is kind of concerned with mundane issues. And I think if you read The Irish Homestead in the National Library, which is something I do often and is a great joy, you really get a sense of actually how human-focused and human-centered he is in everything that he does. So I go to kind of talk a little bit about utopianism and its connections to Ireland, and how AE is actually a really, really important linkage in a kind of long genealogy of utopian thought. And I'm going to argue as well that cooperation is actually a very, very practical way of realizing utopian projects, I suppose. But he's a man who's rich in terms of his connections. And again, I'll only skim the surface of some of those, but you'll get a sense, hopefully, in this paper about how well respected he was, but how he was so influential in so many debates internationally as well. And I think that the key thing I want to argue is that he's a human-centered economist, and I think that's maybe where his relevance to understanding AI is actually very useful to think about some of the ethical issues that it raises, I think, or technology more broadly. So anyway, utopia is an enduring literary genre. You have Utopia by Thomas More, La Città del Sole by Tommaso Campanella, Francis Bacon, William Morris. I'm not sure if Morris and AE ever met. Maybe they did. Someone can maybe tell me afterwards. But it would feel like they have some certain aligned interests. And I just want to ask very quickly, what do people think when someone describes something as utopian? What's your kind of initial response to that? It's idealist? Okay.
Doesn't exist.
It can't exist. Okay, yeah. It's a kind of the impossibility of it. But that's good, because usually it's something that's quite pejorative, I think. Some people see it as to call something utopian. Often the response you get is you're a dreamer, or you're kind of far away from the real world and you don't really understand what's going on. I would argue that actually we all need to be a bit more utopian in terms of trying, I suppose, to unpack many kind of economic, social, political, environmental crises that faces us. And I'm inspired by the work of several writers. Eric Erland Wright, who writes about real utopias. And he argues about the importance of envisioning real utopias. Utopias because they embody emancipatory ideals, real because they attempt to formulate viable institutional designs. And if nothing else, a cooperative with its rules, its principles, its laws is a well-designed institution. And it is something in which it sits at the heart of so many of our communities. Actually, it's with a very, very radical history. Your credit union, I'm sure many of you have a credit union account. And that's real economic democracy. And the credit unions didn't fail when the banks failed in 2008. So there's something about that model that's, our manager at the Dublin Food Co-op often talks about participation is freedom. So this idea about being kind of active in your cooperative is actually, I would say, a good example of a real utopian kind of spirit. And as Albert Einstein once said about the importance of imagination, imagination is more important than knowledge. For knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution. Again, I don't know if Einstein and AE ever had any kind of meeting or correspondence, but they seem to be occupying, even though their careers might seem quite different, they seem to be occupying a very kind of, I would say, a similar headspace, just manifests slightly different perhaps. So I suppose think about the longer durée of utopian history here in Ireland. One is brought back to the experiment at Rallaheen and the work of the utopian socialist Robert Owen. And again, that term utopian is rather pejorative because Frederick Engels refers to the utopian socialists. And he doesn't mean that in a necessarily very complimentary way. He does caricature these people as dreamers, not badly intentioned or maligned, but just they're not, I guess, cut out for the real nitty-gritty of, I suppose, of working out how to resolve the contradictions of capitalism. That, I think, is somewhat to miss the point about what people like Owen were trying to do. So Robert Owen, for those who don't know, is an industrialist, a moral economist, a man very much interested in, I suppose, putting utopia into practice. And he writes various articles with the titles such as The New View of Society. And he comes to Ireland in 1822 at the height of another kind of, there's a famine unfolding in 1822, a kind of precursor to what's going to happen 20 odd years later. And he thinks he has the solution to solve poverty, which is the creation of utopian communes made up of around 2,000 people. So he comes to Dublin, he lectures at the Rotunda. Each of these meetings are packed to the gills. People are outside trying to get in. There's people fainting inside the hall. He also has the flu, so no one can hear him apparently, but it apparently didn't matter. But well, actually maybe it did matter because he didn't raise, people promised to hand over money to help support these utopian communes, but actually nobody did, which is maybe often the case, I suppose. But the Rallaheen commune kind of comes out of that initial propaganda, mission. So Rallaheen is just outside Limerick. It's in County Clare. And I won't go into every nitty-gritty. It's a very, very interesting story, and I urge people to find out more. Margaretta Darcy, the playwright, wrote a wonderful play called Vandeleur's Folly, which sort of details this story. But John Scott Vandeleur was a landlord of the estate in Rallaheen. He's very much inspired by Robert Owen's ideas, but he was also afraid of the outbreak of agrarian outrages and local violence in the County Clare area. So he decided actually he's got to implement this new view of society and try and sort of resolve the tensions on his own estate. So he brings over a man called Edward Craig from Manchester, who was an Owenite and a co-operator, and he becomes a secretary to the Commune Committee that has these objectives. The objects of this association are the acquisition of a common capital, the mutual assurance of its members against the evils of poverty, sickness, infirmity, and old age, the attainment of a greater share of the comforts of life than the working class now possess, the mental and moral improvement of its adult members, and the education of their children. So this is before a welfare state exists, so this is a very, very radical intervention. And it's very successful. So it's over 80 members are drawn, and they run this 618-acre property as a workers' cooperative, essentially. There are strict rules. There's no boozing allowed, no gambling, and that's actually the reason why it collapses. Is not because people weren't drinking or gambling, but it's because the landlord, who still has a legal entitlement to the land, is a gambler, and he gambles it away in the Kildare Street Club in 1833, and the whole thing comes to an end, and the creditors move in, and so the commune collapses. But Edward Craig, he lives till his 90s. He writes constantly about Rallaheen. He keeps saying, look, the solution to the island's problems, the Irish question, is cooperation. And actually, the Irish question would be resolved if you have a rollout of cooperative communes all over the country. He links this to the Home Rule question. He's bombarding William Gladstone constantly with pamphlets he's printing at home, saying, look, this is what you need to do. Don't listen to everyone else. Listen to me. I know. I've got the answer. I've tried it out. Anyway, and he actually does get a couple of wins. He does get some amendments made to one or two of the pieces of the land legislation that had passed in the 1880s in particular. He also has a very insightful grasp about the way in which cooperative ownership of technology matters. And this is the important linkage, I think, with AE, which is one of the reasons why violence had outbroken in Rallaheen was because the land agent had tried to bring in a thrashing mill, and the workers of the commune were afraid this is going to make them no longer needed. They'd be unemployed and they'd be evicted, essentially. So someone shoots the land steward. So it's very tragic. His name is Hastings. In 1832, Rallaheen Commune is the first estate in Ireland to bring in the thrashing machine. This time, because it's owned by the workers, they actually have a big festival to celebrate this liberation from work. I don't think it makes Vandeleur very popular in the area, but Edward Craig does cotton onto this, and he says in a speech in Salford, machinery here is employed for the people and not against them, and the members begin to appreciate its advantages. At first, every considerable prejudice existed against it in the neighbourhood for the introduction of the threshing machine, and it's believed that Mr. Vandeleur's steward was shot prior to the establishment of that. The members now have been disabused of this prejudice and are enabled to see the advantages which will accrue to themselves from its application to their purposes. The advantages they will derive from it will be the diminution of labour and increased production, which will be the common property of themselves. So they all derive an equal benefit from it, essentially. And he refers, again, the utopian language of Rallaheen became a city set on the hill, is how Craig talks about it in the 1880s. Now, this is a hugely influential text, and Craig writes his memoir 50 years after the events. It's a huge influence on James Connolly, who includes it in his Labour and Irish History book. But it's also a huge influence on AE, who in 1919 republishes a kind of an abbreviated version of the book, which he writes an introduction in. And he puts it forward as actually this is, Ireland is on the cusp of home rule or some sort of independence. Actually, we need to try out these ideas. And we have been trying them out in the cooperative movement. So we've done a lot of that work. But essentially, we need to, what does he say? He says, I think it is possible that the soul of Rallaheen may reincarnate speedily in modern Ireland, where people now talk almost as much about cooperation as about Sinn Féin. They are better prepared for communal activity. So I won't go too heavily into this because I think people have touched upon it, but the cooperative movement is a very, very radical intervention in late 19th century Irish history. It's kind of a very, very specific sort of modernization project. The IAOS was founded in 1894 by Horace Plunkett and many of these gentlemen around here, Tom Finlay, Robert Anderson, as a way to direct the growth of this movement that was spreading across the country very, very, very quickly. It preempts the creation of the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction, which is seen as home rule in the dairy. It's the first kind of, I suppose, acquisition of power, governmental power from Westminster to Dublin. And obviously, it's a democratic model that has been put forward. But I suppose what drives it initially is the technological revolution, which is the creation and the invention in 1878 of the cream separator by Carl de Laval in Sweden. And the Scandinavians are very quick to cotton onto the kind of the transformative effect this will have on the dairy industry. And Danish butter, as many people probably remember from the leaving sort of school days, overtakes Irish butter as the kind of the main type of butter that has got to be imported into the British market. So essentially, you can think of butter as the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. This is essentially what's kind of powering the workers on to keep producing more and more and more and more. So it's really, really important. And when I was back in Manchester, the CWS, the headquarters of the British co-op movement, fine buildings there. And I would urge everyone when they visit the city to go to the co-op quarter. You can see in the side of one of the buildings, they have the names inscribed into the architecture of the main global points. So they have New South Wales, they have New York, Tralee, Limerick, and you've seen all these names aside. But it reflects the fact that these places are crucial to the growth of the co-op movement in Britain. That leads to tension between the two movements, which I won't talk about this evening, but it is actually an important moment in the movement's development. So you get a sense here of how quick and rapidly that map of cooperation is spreading in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I'm getting to AE. I realise it's kind of taken me a short while. So Plunkett's diary records Horace Plunkett, the founder of the IAOS and its first president, records his first meeting with George Russell. Saw one George Russell, a £60 a year clerk in Pimm's, but a poet, mystic, theosophist, etc. I'm going to turn him on as an organiser, and I think he will be a success. And he was right about that. And he'd been recommended for the job by Yates, who Plunkett had approached first, but Yates convinced him that actually he'd be much better meeting this accountant from Pimm's. He would be the person who would be able to drive forward the cooperative model better in the west of Ireland. And AE is employed initially as an organiser of cooperative credit societies. So these are the forerunners of the credit union movement. So this is also another important but very controversial part of the co-op movement in its early days. He's spending a lot of time in the kind of the west of Ireland, in the congested districts that they were known then, around Mayo, Galway, Donegal, Sligo, and he's essentially, as someone was saying before, he's riding around the west of Ireland on his bicycle. Almost immediately he's sent out there. He writes to John Millington Synge during his first Christmas as an organiser. He paints a rather bleak vignette, I think, of the holiday periods as he takes on his role as a newly appointed rural bank organiser. He writes from the Eris Hotel in Belmullet, "This wild country here has imposed such a melancholy into my blood that I have not had the heart to write to Yates or anybody else if I could help it. I had nothing to say except the accounts of the distress here, which is a disgrace to humanity, and that is not cheerful subject matter for a letter." So this was tough work that he was engaged in. This was very real, hard, arduous work. He was going around to lots of communities, parishes, trying to convince people it was in their benefit to create a cooperative credit society. And of course, he'd have had to explain what the hell a cooperative credit society was as well. This is the Raiffeisen banks. They were kind of imported as an institution from Germany. In 1906, he gives evidence to a departmental committee on the Department of Agriculture, but he's putting forward the view of the credit organising work that he was involved in. And I've got a quote, part of his evidence that he provides here, because he gives a sense of what it was like, the way in which the banks weren't really working for small farmers in particular. So this is what he says. He says, "The lives of small farmers were so far away from the experiences of bank managers. Even the successful completion of a £5 loan would be extremely financially onerous to them. I remember one farmer telling me his experience in getting a loan of £5 from the National Bank in Ballina. He lived about 14 miles from the bank. He had to bring in 2 securities and pay their return fare. He had to give them dinner and lashings of whiskey, to quote his own phrase. The bank deducted 2 and 6 for a sum of £5 for 3 months. There was the cost of a stamp. He had to give the men a day's work for a day's work's wages for the day he brought them away from their own work. And as he knew he would not be able to make the profit out of his loan in 3 months and would be forced to renew, he had to be good to these men and treat them occasionally to keep them in good temper, or they would not have the new bill. I counted up all the expenses this small farmer was put to and found that when the interest and expenses were added together, they amounted to a charge of 42% altogether. So this is a huge extraction for various reasons, but the point he makes in his evidence is that actually this is a very, very common experience for people. The distance from the bank was a real kind of, I suppose, an obstacle to small farmers in particular, trying to kind of, I guess, grow their property, grow the land, which they're taking over gradually at this period. The peasant proprietor is becoming a tenant farmer in this period. And you can see, actually, he seems to have actually a very quick impact. So 1897 is when he's employed. There are 3 banks. By 1898, there are 15. And in his letters to Yates and others, he's outlined, I've opened another bank. He's very excited about this stuff. His bleak mood does seem to change as he goes on. He's also staying with priests and bishops, and Bishop O'Donnell in Donegal, and he loves having intellectual jousts with them. And he's sending them provocative poems and pamphlets about the priests. So he enjoys, but the priests and bishops seem to enjoy this as well. So he often stays with them too. So in this work as well, and this is maybe, and here's one of his famous quotes in Gombianism. So this is his impression of, I suppose, the Irish rural society at this time, which is, you get a very kind of strong critique of Gombianism, which actually is a big part of, I suppose, AE's rhetoric at this time as well, to kind of, you get the sort of, the local appointments are in the gift of the Gombian men, and to get drunken doctors, drunken JPs. He wasn't in favour of drink, I don't think. So, and probably he's seen a lot of it. So that's, in fact, round the Gombian system reels the whole drunken, congested world. But it's along this time he meets Moritz Bonn, who was a German economist, and he conducts his PhD studies in rural Ireland in the late 1890s. And he meets AE, introduced AE by Plunkett in the congested districts. So Bonn's work on Ireland is published in 1906 as The English Colonization in Ireland. And then a shorter version is translated by T.W. Rolleston as Modern Ireland and Her Agrarian Problems. So I've not read the 700-page German version. My German's not good enough, sadly, but the shorter English version is well worth a read. It's actually very prescient and it's a very kind of acutely observed Ireland in transition, really, and very much focused on the land question, which he sees as kind of being the morbid symptom of English colonialism. Bonn is really interesting because he's one of the first theorists of decolonization. So he spends a lot of time in South Africa, meets Patrick Hannon, who was out there at the time. And he sees an island, he uses it as an essay to kind of talk about decolonization in the interwar period. So we know about the waves of decolonization after the Second World War. Bonn was arguing for this in the 1920s and 1930s, and he uses Ireland as an example about the way in which colonialism has a very, very deep and negative impact on society. And he sees the land question as being the best example of that. You can see his ideas are also reflected in the discussions he's having with AE as well at the time. So, as also been mentioned, he becomes the editor of the Irish Homestead from 1905. He was contributing before then, but it's really from late 1905 onwards, you get a huge amount of kind of, his editorials are really ramped up, and the selections by Henry Summerfield are just a joy to read. I love pulling them down and kind of, drawing on them. So this is where a lot of the movement's educational work is taking place as well. It's also a cultural, it's an important cultural magazine as well. It publishes James Joyce's first short story on the recommendation of AE. So in Ulysses, when Stephen Dedalus talks about AE, I owe you, that's Joyce saying, I owe you one, mate, which he did. And this is, I suppose, where you get the working out of AE's economic ideas and many other ideas as well. And AE's cooperative village as a type of Tír na nÓg. So he doesn't really use the word utopia, but he talks about Tír na nÓg a lot as a kind of an expression about the way we're working towards building a Tír na nÓg. And this quote from his article, The Cooperative Village in 1905, it's one of the first pieces he writes, I think, as the editor. It comes out in November. But he talks here about the community that will feed and clothe itself. It will have come to see that homespun is good enough to be fashionable. It is good enough for the community to wear, and the day of shoddy will be over. Every garden will grow enough peas, beans, lettuce, parsnips, apples, pears, strawberries, rhubarb, etc., to make a varied and delightful diet, and the flesh and bones of Irish men and women won't be made altogether out of potatoes or their blood of tea. He also had a thing against tea. He felt that tea was driving people to the asylums as well. So he was very opposed to tea drinking. But reading this, it was he a coffee man, was he? Oh, yeah, it could well have been. But in reading this, like being a member of Dublin Food Co-op, I think this sort of actually captures our values a lot. And we would love to have our own kind of like allotment plot here in the city of Dublin, which to kind of grow some of our own material like this. But anyway, there are some who will sneer at these ideals. It is not lofty enough for them. It is a mere earthly paradise of cakes and ale. But the good and simple things by which life endures are the things the wise will aim at. What we fear is that in this helpless and hopeless country where we've had a century of unsuccess, most people will look up on our picture as unrealizable as Tír na nÓg. But it is all possible, and more than that is possible. So this is a very hopeful utopian description, I would say, of like the way Ireland could be. So there's a crisis in cooperation, and it's falling out of the state around 1906, 1907. And T.W. Russell replaces Horace Plunkett as essentially the first Minister of Agriculture in 1907. T.W. Russell, I don't think, is related to AE. People might correct me if I'm wrong about that. But they've got a very different outlook anyway. In reading for this, one of the things I found out is how controversial cooperative credit was. So there's a lot of focus about the way in which the creameries were seen as a model of modernisation that were put forward by the IAOS. But Russell and others were arguing that through the provision of cheap credit by the department and the congested district boards to the western seaboards of Ireland, through the mechanism of credit societies, that this was kind of unfairly gaming the system. So actually, there's a big, long political tussle, which Plunkett returns to Plunkett. Well, it's not Plunkett House then, is it? It's Lincoln Place, I think, as president of the IAOS, and he leaves from being the Minister of Agriculture. And from that point on, T.W. Russell is there as the Minister of Agriculture till 1918, and he's kind of the bête noire, I think, of people like AE, and you'll see AE is responding often to kind of statements that are put out by the Department of Agriculture in this period. It's also exacting a huge toll as well. He talks in some of his letters to Charles Weeks, his great friend, cooperation, when it arrives, will be built of our dead bodies and exhausted brains. And in Ireland, I'm getting more and more unpopular because of my rootless economics. I dare say I have friends in the cooperative movement, but not 10 of them know that I'm either artist or poet. And I'm jolly glad they do not know, or they would have no confidence in me and regard me as a mere farmer of the pen. So he's become a lot more unpopular after June 1913 because he's put his neck on the line for the workers of Dublin during the lockout, and he thought he could have lost his job. But Plunkett and the others stand by him and say, that's your personal thing, but as long as you don't bring it into the Irish homestead. Look, I won't read. I'll share these slides afterwards if people want them. But Cooperation and Nationality, which is published in 1912, and then The National Being in 1916, I think are two of his great works where he kind of outlines what Ireland could be. It's his vision for the future. But what I like about the title of this is that this is from this to the next generation. So AE is thinking in terms of the long-term impacts. How do you keep these ideas in the ether? How do you keep them relevant? And he sees that as an important part of what he's doing, not just talking to his contemporaries, but talking to future generations. And again, with The National Being, which is a wonderful book where he's essaying some of his ideas. This was a book that was read by Gandhi, apparently. So AE has a huge impact on Gandhi's thought. And I think AE is actually, when people talk about decolonizing curriculums or decolonizing economics, I think of him as a very, very profound anti-colonial thinker, because he's measuring and he's valuing things that aren't usually being measured in terms of economic growth, for example. He's more interested maybe in also promoting Tír na nÓg as well. He becomes involved in the Irish Convention. this is where his politics start radicalising and becomes more closely aligned to Sinn Féin. Well, he's never a member of Sinn Féin, but his politics are seen as kind of aligning with them. But I think the experience of the First World War is also profound because he begins to generate an economic critique of Britain in Ireland, because he writes an article in June 1918 for the journal Studies, which was edited by Father Tom Finlay, called The Self-Supporting Community. And he believed, because of this growth of a wartime state, where the British state is intervening in all forms of agriculture and the economy, that actually this is a bad faith actor, and that Ireland actually really does need independence now, because it needs to kind of pursue its own model of economic development, which is best essayed by the co-operative movement. So he's quite prominent towards the end of the First World War. He's appearing in front of the the British Labour Party and Trade Union Congress, where he stays with his friend Beatrice and Sidney Webb. So we know he's very close to the Fabians, and I think they are influenced by him. And this is Beatrice's, so he goes to stay with Beatrice Webb the night before he gives his evidence to the Irish Labour Party Trade Union Congress. And she talks about him being a poet, artist, saint, and propagandist. And he's a sensationally delightful person. Apparently her husband wasn't as fond of him, she says, but she was a big fan. He believes in the undifferentiated man doing some simple individual job with dutiful care, but with his heart in pleasant, comely things, and developing here and there into the mystic and the saint. He hates cities, he hates railways, machinery, division of labour, rule, method, and specialised science and logical reason. All the things the Fabians loved. So you can see maybe why Sidney maybe wasn't getting on too well in terms of some of the ideas. People who are then coming to Ireland during the War of Independence and they want to understand what's happening, they go to A.E.'s house in Rathgar or here to Plunkett House to his office. So you have Ruth Russell, whose short book, What's the Matter with Ireland? She basically goes on a tour that A.E. sends her out on. So she goes up to Temple Crone to see cooperation in action. She goes down to Limerick and it just happens to be there when the Limerick Soviet breaks out. She has a great description of meeting the Soviet leaders where she goes to interview these Reds and they stop for the Angelus. So he's quite confused about what's going on. And Ibrahim Rashad, who is an Egyptian, like Ireland, he's upset that Egypt has been shut out of the Treaty of Versailles negotiations. So he comes to Ireland to actually learn how to decolonize and, fight for Egyptian independence. But he discovers that it's through the cooperative movement that most likely got developed that kind of national identity. And again, he talks about he described him as a man of genius whose influence on the ideals of the movement lifted it out of parochialism to the place it holds today as a mainspring in Irish national aspirations. And Ruth Russell here also talks about the fact that she spends time, if I could go back to any period in history, to go to one of A.E.'s open houses in Rathgar, where he seemed to be holding court and bringing in all these great artists, writers, politicians, international people who are passing through. So he is less interested in Sinn Féin's kind of movement towards violence, but he states that he believes he's the only living pacifist and disputes the value of bloody methods. He advocates the peaceful revolution of cooperation. I am coming towards the end, so this is kind of a whistle-top tour, but A.E. then also after the establishment of the Free State, there's a kind of a narrative that he sort of is a bit despondent about the way Irish politics is going. He's a supporter of the Free State, but he's also a critic as well through the pages of the Irish Statesman. But he's also really interested in staying on top of economic ideas. So R.M. Fox, who's a trade unionist, moves to Ireland. He writes a series of articles called The Machine Age, and I came across A.E.'s unpublished preface. So these collection of articles were supposed to be published as a book. They never were, but A.E. had written a preface to the collection. And in the book that didn't come out, Fox talks about the dynamo has taken the place of the cathedral in our civilization. So essentially, he's seeing the move towards a machine civilization, particularly in urban areas, as somehow he doesn't go as far as saying injuring the soul, but he's kind of saying it's dehumanizing people. It's a machine-focused economy, and we're not thinking about the human labor that's going into that. And that's something that A.E. does agree with. In the unpublished preface, he says, Mr. Fox, who endured far more than I did, and whose knowledge is far greater, has brooded on the problem of how life in these dark satanic mills might be humanized. I supplicate interest in his ideas of amelioration. We may be certain that humanity will revolt against any system which does not take account of its own nature. Almost any system may endure if the spirits of human kindness, which can reconcile things otherwise incompatible, is present. But if the machine is made dominant and human nature is not considered, then it is certain there will be upheavals. In 1930 and 1931, he embarked on one of his mega tours of the United States to lecture on the importance of rebuilding rural society in the United States. Reading the accounts of this tour, you can tell it's a very, very arduous journey. It's 6-7 months. He's traveling back and forwards, crisscrossing the country, and it does push him towards exhaustion. He's kind of dreaming about returning to Donegal. But he kind of, I suppose he echoes some arguments that have been made by Bertrand Russell at the time. So again, the major theme was revitalizing civilization. He gets himself into a bit of hot water for defending idleness, which didn't go down well in the United States. There are various op-eds written about him. What he said was, when I was a boy, I used to amuse myself by caricaturing my teachers. In fact, I don't think any more idle youth ever went to school than I. I don't mean to corrupt American lads by saying so, but I've always thought that idleness was not a vicious crime, but an adorable recreation. It is only through idleness that one finds time for reverie and thus discover one's soul. He also identifies the American poet Longfellow's lines, "Let us then be up and doing," as the source of all our social woes, promoting industriousness as it does at the cost of people devoting time to recreation and splendid talk. And finally, he also debates people from across the political spectrum, but I came across this article, which is a debate about our machine civilization. And it's a debate with Morris Hillquit, who was at the time one of the most prominent American socialists. So he'd been promoting his ideas for the establishment of a rural civilization, ideas that get taken up by Henry Wallace, Francis Perkins, as well, the Secretary of Labour under FDR. And Morris Hillquit has a deep belief in the promise of technological progress and the improvement of workers' lives. And he accuses AE, who was suspicious of this promise of liberty through technological advancement, as being, quote, a figment of romantic imagination. And what was it that AE had said to provoke such an epithet? He'd said, "It is not only in the country that the engineer and scientists enable fewer people to produce more. It is happening in the cities of the old and new world. By mergers, by rationalization, by more efficient machinery and organization, fewer people are needed to produce what is required. Will this go on? I think so. I see in your country and in Europe gathering multitudes of workers for whom there is no employment. The very perfecting of the industrial system is bringing this about. Will not these unemployed gather in dark slums and in one room as they do in Europe? It is because I foresee this that I wish to the reformers and foreseers in your country to think of building up a rural civilization, something which has never yet been seen." Okay, I've just got to conclude now, I suppose, some kind of loose thoughts. I mean, I suppose one consistent thread that sits through AE's career is the importance of rural civilization. And for him, this doesn't mean it's a backwards, parochial place where not much is happening. It's got to be a very, very vibrant place where there's got to be libraries, there's got to be lectures, there's got to be, some of the first cinemas are actually started by cooperative societies. But it's also, I suppose, he sees economics as being, it's a moral form of economics with a very ethical disposition in which he consistently argues for placing the human being at the center of any economic discussion. That comes through more and more, I think, in his later writings and lectures. So I also think he's an important figure in trying to understand the decolonization of national economies. And actually, in that article he produced about the cooperative village, and not a cooperative parish, he didn't like the word parish, it's a cooperative village. You can sort of see, actually, this is probably got to be unpopular to say, but some of Eamon de Valera's ideas around, the kind of St. Patrick's Day, that St. Patrick's Day speech in 1943 about kind of romping, sturdy individuals. But actually, I think thinking about economic debates today, there is this element, there's a prelude to some of the degrowth debates that are going on. This is the kind of pursuit of extractivism and growth for growth's sake, which we've been living with for much of the 20th and early 21st century. AE's actually offers a kind of a relatively sharp rebuke to that. So I'm still trying to think through what that might mean for some of our present day debates. And, I guess the question we should always be asking is, what is the objective that we're aiming for in any form of economic activity that we're undertaking? So in that respect, I think he is an economist for our times, and I think I would prefer a world designed by AE than one designed by AI. So I'll leave it at that.